Hi, guys. Welcome to Real Food Recovery. We have a special guest today that I am excited to bring to you. We have Mallary Tenore Tarpley, who is a journalism and writing professor at the University of Texas at Austin's Moody College of Communication and McCombs School of Business. Her writing has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the LA Times, and the Dallas Morning News, among other publications. She is the recipient of a prestigious Alfred P. Sloan Foundation grant, which helps support her research and writing. Mallary graduated from Providence College and has a master's of fine arts in nonfiction writing from Goucher College. She lives outside of Austin, Texas, with her husband and two children, and Slip is her very first book. So, hello, Mallary. How are you? We are excited to have you. Anything else you want to tell us about you before I ask the question of kind of how you got into this and what brought you to this place where we are seated today?
Well,
How's it
thank you
going?
so much for having me. And that was a lovely introduction. I think you covered a lot of the bases, and I'll delve deeper into my story as we go throughout the conversation.
Wonderful. Yeah, so do you want to just start with a little bit of background of your life history? Because obviously, I'm assuming that played a big role in what got you to where you are today, how you became this author and the field you went into. So let us know a little bit more about you.
Sure. So I have written a lot about my own personal experiences with anorexia nervosa, which I developed when I was 12 years old after my mother died of metastatic breast cancer. So I was really struggling pretty acutely with anorexia for much of my adolescence. And when I was 13, I was officially diagnosed with anorexia and was hospitalized and was in and out of the hospital on five separate occasions and then in residential treatment for a year and a half.
Wow.
So, spent most of my teenage years in treatment and then went through a period where I felt like I was trying to be fully recovered, even though I didn't exactly know what that meant. And
Mm-hmm.
then ended up relapsing in college because I just felt like the pressure of trying to maintain this full recovery, which I had always equated with the perfectionistic ideal, was insurmountable
Mm-hmm.
in a lot of ways. And
Mm-hmm.
so I struggled for over 10 years beginning in college with a vicious cycle of binge eating and restricting, and found it very difficult to get out of that. But it wasn't until my late 20s when I began to reframe my thinking around recovery and began to think about this concept that I call the middle place, which is this gray space between acute sickness and full recovery. And in writing my book and just in thinking about my own recovery journey, it's been really important for me to frame it as a work in progress rather than a perfectionistic ideal.
I love that. I love that. You mentioned that, first of all, I'm sorry about what happened to you with your mother when you were a young girl. And when you were talking about that, it got me thinking about, is this considered a disease of young girls, or is it more associated with a traumatic event in someone's life?
I think that's a really important question because we do know that the average age of onset for people with eating disorders tends to be college aged individuals,
Mm,
but we
hmm.
see people of all ages struggling. So, certainly, children can struggle even as young as elementary school age children. But we also know that eating disorders affect people who are older and who are in midlife and beyond. I was recently
Hmm.
quoted in a New York Times article about anorexia in midlife and middle age.
Oh.
And it was a story really looking at the fact that there are many people who are in their 50s, 60s, even 70s who do struggle with eating disorders, and yet they're often overlooked or they're stigmatized or they feel like they can't really seek treatment because they feel as though they should be over their eating disorder by that point in
Hmm.
life.
Hmm.
So there can really be any number of triggers that will lead to the onset of a disorder, and happy to talk more about those if you'd like.
Well, that's just so fascinating because this is going to expose my ignorance, but really did not know that that is something that could come on mid-life. I mean, I've had stressful events where, like during that peak stress time where I couldn't eat, you just can't eat. But then as the trauma or stress or whatever of that situation lifts, then your appetite normally, which I understand that's not the same as the eating disorder, but I just didn't, out of ignorance, I just did not know that that was something that could happen later in life. Or are
Yeah, I
you
think
saying that people have it all the time? It just manifests itself finally more later.
Yeah, I mean, it can be the case where someone has an eating disorder earlier on in life and then they just continue to struggle for a lifetime.
Mm,
Other times it may be that someone struggled with it earlier in their life and then they were in a period of recovery for many years, but then there was some sort of trigger that really ignited the eating
mm,
disorder again later on in life.
mm-hmm,
And then I've also
mm-hmm.
talked with individuals for whom they found that the eating disorder actually did just start later in life. I would say that that tends to be less common, but certainly it's not unheard of.
Hmm. So interesting. I'm glad you shared that. I've already learned something, and we're only a few minutes in.
Yes.
Let's talk about the name of your book. Very interesting, and I'm sure there is purpose behind that and meaning behind that. The word slip, what does that mean to you in your healing journey? And talk a little bit more about how your book is incredibly honest about naming those relapse moments and how that helps build trust within yourself.
Yeah. So I was trying to think through what I wanted to title my book. And I came upon this word slip because I think that for so long I was petrified of slipping,
Oh,
particularly.
totally.
Yes, when I left treatment, especially, I thought I've been in treatment for so many years and I don't want to go back into treatment. And I really thought that there were only two extremes that you were either acutely sick or you were fully recovered. And so I was so afraid that if I made one wrong move, I would very quickly slide back into dangerous territory and get sick again. And so that was a really debilitating place to be in the sense that
Mm-hmm.
I really felt like I had to be so perfect at recovery and at everything I ate and every move that I made. And so it really led to the point where anytime I would slip, it felt like a failure. And that sort of defeating mindset very often would lead me to find myself in a place where a slip had suddenly turned into a slide. Because, for instance, in college, when I would sort of be in this cycle of binge eating and restricting, I would think, well, I ate the whole carton of ice cream, might as well just keep going. And then
Mm-hmm.
wake up the next day and think, well, I binged last night, so I might as well just restrict the whole day. And it was
Mm-hmm.
this really horrible place to be. And it wasn't until I started to reframe my thinking around this middle place that I mentioned that I began to question whether or not slips could be more normalized and whether I could remove the stigma and shame around slips and think of them really as a way to move forward, because I think very often we tend to focus on slips and think of them as something negative, but the very word slip suggests some sort of forward movement because you can't slip if you're standing still. And so I like to think, okay, I slipped,
I
but
love
that doesn't
that.
mean that I have failed. How can I learn from that and get back up and keep moving forward? And I remember that when I first told a dietitian about the name of my book, and she works with eating disorder patients, but she had said, I wouldn't title it slip because that has a really negative connotation in our field. And I thought, well, that's precisely the point. I don't think it should have a negative connotation.
Mm-hmm.
So I really want to try to normalize slips and not in a way that makes people think, oh, well, I can just slip every day all the time and it's fine, but more so in terms of recognizing that these slips happen and we need to give ourselves grace because that ultimately is going to move us forward in our recovery.
I totally agree with that. And it's interesting because you work with people in the eating disorder world while we work with people that are suffering from ultra processed food use disorder. And so my word that I like to use when I'm working with people is sidestep. So it's not like it's backwards or forwards. You just had a little, yeah, a little shuffle. But, and, a lot of times when people shuffle to the right, they shuffle back to the left because that's kind of how dance moves are, right? It's like you're just doing a dance move. You're not doing a slip. You're just doing a move. And anyway, I like that because we're human. That's going to happen. And so I so connected with you when you were talking about, well, I had this binge tonight. Well, I've got one flat tire. I might as well go ahead and slash the other three, right? And that's where we need to help people with that level of thinking of, instead of slashing the other three, how do we show love? How do we show compassion? How do we show understanding that this is a very difficult disease when you're working with people that rely on food to live? That exponentially makes things more difficult in the healing, right? Versus some of the other addictions. I'm not saying, I know that's not an addiction that you have with the eating disorder people, but it's difficult when you're dealing with something that you still have to do 3 times a day to survive. It complicates things a little bit versus people that are trying to get off drugs or alcohol or pornography or shopping or things like that. It just compounds the layers a little bit more. So I love that you are trying to get away from that black and white thinking, that binary thinking of, I'm either going to do it perfect or the wheels are going to come off the bus and I'm just going to go berserk here. So what helped you to begin to break out of that binary thinking? Did you have like a light bulb moment? Did you have an experience that happened? Was it just a slow burn of, hey, wait a second. I can see a correlation here between how I think about myself and the compassion I give myself, and really how I pull out of out of this slip or sidestep a little sooner.
Yeah, so it's interesting because I often make sense of the world through writing and storytelling, just as a journalist. And
Hmm.
when I was in my late 20s, I was director of a small nonprofit organization, and I was tasked with helping journalists how to tell restorative narratives. This was a genre that we were trying to build that essentially looks at how people and communities make meaningful progress in the aftermath of illness or trauma or tragedy. Because so often in news media, we get the story about the trauma or tragedy or the illness, and then the story fades and the coverage fades. And maybe we get a 1 year anniversary story, for instance. But there's so much storytelling that happens in that messy middle as people are trying to move forward. And I think that that messy middle gets overlooked, but that's where some of the most important learning takes place. And it's where people begin to identify with what makes them resilient. It's where people have these slips. And so, as I was training journalists on how to tell these restorative narratives, it occurred to me that this could actually be a really helpful framework for thinking about my own story, because for so long I was ignoring this middle place because I really didn't think that this could be a safe place to live in. I thought that it should be secretive, that I wasn't fully recovered. And I thought, what if I were to shed more light on the fact that I am navigating this messy middle? And what would that look like to tell more truthful and authentic stories about that? And
Hmm.
so I began to write some essays about just where I was at in my recovery, because for so
Hmm.
long I had told everyone that I was fully recovered, even during those 10 years when I was binging and restricting. And there was this huge disconnect between the narrative I was sharing with everyone else and my own lived reality. And so for me, it was really important to think about the gray spaces in my own story and think about how can I speak truth to that in a way that feels authentic and maybe in a way that helps other people feel less alone. So for me, it was really writing about it and
Oh.
speaking truth to it in a somewhat public way, because I was publishing these essays on my website and trying to get people to read them. And in doing so, I recognized that I was far from alone. And I think that that was really powerful for me to realize that I didn't have to keep my struggles secretive. I could really be open about them. And the more I shared my story, I found the more I was able to actually make progress in my recovery.
I love that because we talk a lot about in the ultra processed food use disorder about how connection is the opposite of addiction. And so I don't know how much you know about us, but we have this online group coaching support community. And it is very difficult, and I would be interested in your opinion, to really survive or recover without some level of support. Would you agree with that?
I definitely would. I don't think that people can really recover alone, at least not in any sort of sustained way. I think
Mm-hmm.
that having those connections, even if it's just one person you trust, can be incredibly
Yeah.
helpful.
Yeah.
But ideally, you have a team of people helping you. But I
Yeah.
think that that companionship is just so critical when you think
Yeah.
about recovery.
Yeah. I've also heard the saying that big change happens in community too. How do you feel about that statement?
I think so as well. I think that there can be a lot of value in eating disorder support groups, for instance, or just
Mm-hmm.
recovery support groups, because it enables you to realize that you are not alone in this. And
Right.
that is incredibly powerful.
Right? I mean, like the biggest thing ever, because I don't know about you, but I'm guessing when you were 12, it's not like you were going around telling people what was going on. How would you even have the language for it? I was in my mid 50s before I understood what a sugar addiction was. I just thought I had a willpower problem. So for decades, I lived with, and ain't nobody talking about it, by the way. I was not saying a peep about that, about my sugar binges to my girlfriends. I might joke and say, "Oh, I just can't stop eating those cookies or ice cream once I get started." But I really didn't even understand what was happening. I didn't have the language for it. I didn't understand the science behind it. So I'm sure if we were talking about how this is typically the eating disorders is a disease of young girls, how would they have a clue what's going on? So I can't imagine the pain and suffering and isolation that they would be experienced during that time. And how scary. That's trauma in and of itself, right? Just that alone. So, and then let's compound the eating disorder on top of that, trauma upon trauma with that.
Yes, very much so. And I think there's a lot of misconceptions about eating disorders. I know when I was 12 and struggling, I was under the misguided perception that people with anorexia didn't eat anything at all. And I was still eating enough to survive, not nearly enough, but still was eating. And so I thought, I don't have anorexia. And so I think that a lot of times people have this mentality that they're not sick enough or they don't necessarily know enough about the eating disorder to
Oh.
even call it that. They might think, well, I have disordered eating. But if you actually were to look at their symptomology, you would realize, okay, they do actually meet the diagnostic criteria for a full fledged
Mhm.
eating disorder. So it can be very
Mhm.
isolating because we know that only 30% of people who struggle with eating disorders actually seek treatment, which is an incredibly low percentage when you think about how many people do
Wow.
struggle.
No, I did not know that is, it's painful to hear
It is.
because there's so much suffering that's going on out there. And that kills me, in our own community. It just is crushing to see people spend a day in the brain of someone who is just fighting, fighting, fighting for peace. I mean, don't you think the ultimate desire is just peace in the brain, calm in the brain?
Yes, very much so. Yeah. And I think that you can't ever really be at peace with your body if you're always at war with food.
Totally. And again, it goes back to that vicious cycle. Unfortunately, we do have to eat to live. And so it just compounds the problem. We talked a little bit about what's the genesis of where the eating disorder comes from. We know with the ultra processed food use disorder that some people it's genetic, it's environment, it's trauma, it's continued exposure from the time your eyeballs open in this world, surrounded by the fact that you're living in the midst of a hyperpalatable world where it's everywhere, and then the brain's reward system gets hijacked by these foods where then you're just craving them, and you just want more and more, and it takes more and more just to feel normal instead of get a high like we used to. But can we talk about some of what are at the roots of driving these eating disorders? I know that your field is trying to break away a little bit from the old adage that eating disorder is just a form of people trying to exercise control in their life. But maybe what I'd like for you to speak about is how you feel about that statement. Is it just about control, or if it stems from something else? Maybe there's a lot we can learn from what these major contributors are.
Sure. So I do think that we tend to just simplify narratives as a society, and that has become a very simplified explanation for why people develop eating disorders. I so often hear that it's just about control. And I certainly think that control is part of it for many people, but it's not the full story. If I look at my own experiences, for instance, after my mother died, I found myself feeling farther away from her than ever before. And I really wanted to stop time and I wanted to stay close to her. And so I came up with this idea as a 12-year-old that maybe if I stayed the same size I was when my mom was alive, I could somehow be closer to her. And so it was that trauma coupled with this desire to stay small and safe that really spurred on that food restriction. And certainly control was part of that. When I lost her, I felt like I had lost all control. And I thought, well, I can't control what happened to my mom's body, but I can control what I put into mine.
Yeah.
And so I think that control can certainly be part of it, but there's so many other elements at play, trauma being one of them, but also genetic predispositions. And then sometimes there can just be these triggers that may seem really innocuous at the onset, but they can lead a person to restrict their food intake. And those triggers might be something like an offhand comment that someone makes about your body, or a
Mm.
desire to lose weight so you can run faster on the cross country team,
Oh.
or even something like a choking incident that makes someone fearful of eating again. And as people restrict their food intake in response to these triggers, there are different unconscious biological adaptations that occur in the brain, including altered reward circuits that can really reinforce food restriction. And
Mm-hmm.
so people can very quickly find themselves trapped in what some researchers call a psychobiological conflict, between a person's conscious motivation to restrict food and then the body's unconscious motivation to seek out food in response to that restriction. So it's really complicated in a lot of ways because it's not
Mm-hmm.
just about someone wanting to lose weight or just choosing not to eat. There really are these changes that are happening biologically, neurobiologically, that can really make someone quickly descend into an eating disorder.
Yeah. That's interesting. And I want to follow up with that and ask a little bit about if there is a genetic component, if they're finding, if studies are finding that there's any type of genetic correlation there, familial, generational, anything like that. We know with the ultra processed food use disorder that being in a negative energy balance is often a huge trigger for cravings or binges. But those who suffer from the anorexia find that to be like a euphoric state and feel like starvation is their drug. So, looking at those two extreme differences, one would never think that we had anything in common. However, it's interesting to note that we are discovering some similarities where genetics can play a role in each of these, and those with the ultra processed food use disorder often suffer from ADHD because of that lower baseline of dopamine in ADHD, and food becomes that quick fix for boredom because I know if I'm bored, that is like my most dangerous place ever. So I have to really actually pay deep attention to my day. And if like there's a 15-minute downtime where nothing's scheduled, that can undo, that literally can be my undoing. So we know that ADHD is like 70 to 80% genetic. So anyway, do you want to talk about some genetic correlations when you're among those that are battling the eating disorder?
Yes. And this was really fascinating for me to learn because as I was writing SLIP, I interviewed a lot of researchers and clinicians, including Dr. Cynthia Bulick, who is a very well known geneticist within the eating
Mm-hmm.
disorder field. And it was really
Mm-hmm.
fascinating for me just to learn about the genetic components of eating disorders because certainly when I was acutely sick in the late 90s, we really didn't know much at all about how genetics played into eating disorders. And so research does show that females who have a relative with anorexia are 11 times more likely to develop the disorder themselves compared to individuals without a family history. And so I remember reading this statistic initially and getting really scared. But
Yeah.
it's also important to recognize that we don't inherit eating disorders, we inherit a vulnerability to them. So, in other words,
Ooh.
we're not doomed if we're the child of someone with an eating disorder, and our children are not doomed if we've had an eating disorder. And so, Dr. Bulick and others I interviewed have said that there's really four key elements that determine a person's risk for developing an eating disorder. So, certainly, there are genetic risk factors, but there's also genetic protective factors. And then there are environmental risk factors and
That's what I wanted to talk
environmental,
about.
yeah, there's environmental risk and protective factors. And those sort of four factors are like the four suits in a deck of cards.
Mm-hmm.
And so we could think of this in terms of spades and clubs for risk and protective genetic factors, and diamonds
Mm-hmm.
and hearts for risk and protective environmental factors. And we're each dealt a hand, one that we carry throughout our lives. And we don't have any say over how many spades or clubs we hold, but our number of diamonds and hearts, which are those environmental protective and risk factors, may change over time, right? Depending on how we grow up and how we care for ourselves and how we respond to the events that shape our lives. So, in many ways, eating disorders are the result of what happens not just within us, but also
Mm-hmm.
around us. And lastly, I'll just say too that there's been some really fascinating genome wide studies that have also found that the genetic basis of anorexia overlaps with metabolic traits. And so, some of the same genetic factors associated with increased risk for anorexia are actually associated with decreased risk of type 2 diabetes and obesity.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I interviewed Dr. Bulick, she was making this really bold claim that I think makes a lot of sense. And she said that she has really reframed her thinking around eating disorders as being metabolic psychiatric disorders. She told me that she used to say anorexia is a psychiatric illness and obesity is a metabolic illness. And we have to talk about those as two different things. But when she saw the results of these genome wide studies, she said, I changed my tune, right? She said, I really think that there are metabolic components to anorexia. So, all of this research is relatively new and also just really fascinating as we think about all of the different elements that are outside of our control.
Yeah.
And also recognizing, though, too, that there are some that are more within our control as we think about the environmental components.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I love that you brought up the environment because I think that is so profound when it comes to obesity. I don't know if you've heard the saying that genetics loads the gun, but lifestyle pulls the trigger.
Yes.
And so think about if you're a kid and you're surrounded by either ultra processed food everywhere and that's all your family eats, or if you're a kid and you're surrounded by people that aren't eating and have maybe they talk about it more or just they see people restricting more. I mean, those are those formative years, right?
Yes.
And you're going to be the most similar to the five people closest to you. So how could it not have a heavy impact with genetics? In fact, I wonder what's more of a greater impact, genetics or environment. I wonder if anybody's ever
Mm.
studied that. You don't, do you know? I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know of any studies that have really looked at that. Maybe because it would be so different for each person, but
Yeah.
yeah, but I do think it is important to recognize that there is no one eating disorder gene, right? I think that some people think, "Oh, well, I've got the eating
You've got
disorder gene because my aunt had an eating disorder, my mother did." It's like, no, there's so many genes that contribute
Mhm.
to someone's likelihood of getting an eating disorder. So there's not just one gene
Right.
or one genetic mutation. And so I think that that's important because, again, we're not
Mhm.
doomed, right? If we have a family member with an eating disorder.
Which I want to shout that from the rooftop, right? Don't worry, just stay in your lane, get garner information, be aware, and those are the protective steps you can take. Unless, do you want to add any other big protective steps if people are in that situation and surrounded by it in their family?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that it is just important to make sure that, particularly if there are kind of more restrictive eating disorders in your family, like anorexia, to just try to avoid situations where you might end up in an energy deficit, which is
Yeah.
essentially where the amount of calories you're consuming is less than the amount of calories that you're expending. Because we
Mm-hmm.
do know that when people who are predisposed to an eating disorder end up in that energy deficit, it can be a trigger that can lead
Mm-hmm.
to the onset of an eating disorder, or that can lead to a relapse. So I think that's something for people who do have a family history of eating disorders to really just be cognizant of that.
Yeah. You know how we were talking a minute ago about how when the eating disorder client is in that energy deficit state, how that's more of a euphoric state for them. It this crazy thought just came into my head. Have you heard of these people that fast for like, I don't know, 3 or 4 or 5 days, like just like a water fast or something like that? And they talk about, oh, I feel so great. And is that the same euphoric state that we're talking about? Are they experiencing the same thing?
It could be. I have not done research specifically on that to look at direct comparisons, but there is something to that. I mean, it could be that people who are genetically predisposed may have a greater euphoria that actually
Hmm.
propels them to continue with those behaviors of restriction, whereas someone
Hmm.
who's not predisposed may feel that euphoria, but they aren't triggered by it, and so they're
Hmm.
then able to just start eating again,
Yeah.
whereas someone with the eating disorder may very quickly descend into disordered behaviors and thoughts because of that fasting.
Yeah, that's a great point because I try and fast for religious reasons once a month for a 24-hour or 2 meals. And I do feel f fine. By the end of it, I feel fine. I feel a little hungry on the first half, but the second half, I usually feel fine and good. But the difference is I will just go ahead and start eating again. So, anyway, just I was just thinking about that. So, many of our listeners don't have a formal eating disorder diagnosis, but their relationship with food still feels deeply disordered, maybe chaotic, obsessive, and often secretive. So, what would you say to someone who doesn't see themselves in a traditional eating disorder recovery, but feels stuck in like a similar cycle?
I do think it's really important to try to seek help. And that may seem just like a no brainer, but I can't tell you how many people I interviewed for my book who would say, well, I've been going to therapy for years for my anxiety and my depression, but I haven't actually talked with my therapist about my eating habits and about my disordered eating or about my eating disorder, because I just don't really feel like I can talk to anybody about it, or I don't think that I'm sick enough, or I don't know if they'll understand. And so that has always been so striking to me because I think so many of us almost normalize it to the point where we think, oh, well, everyone struggles with some food issue. And so I don't really need help. This is just sort of how I am and how I've always been. But I don't think it's ever too late to seek help. And I think it's really important to recognize that when we are silent about what we're dealing with, it really does keep us stuck and it keeps us sick. And again, once I started sharing my story and really putting it out into the open and sharing it publicly, that's when I was really able to make meaningful progress in my recovery because I no longer was keeping myself silenced, and I was able to really speak truth to what it was I was dealing with. And so I would just say, recognizing that you are worthy of that care, however that care may take shape.
Hmm. Let's talk a little bit. Thank you for that answer. I love that. Let's talk a little bit about that area of recovery where we want to avoid labeling foods as good or bad, because in the eating disorder world, the recovery there often warns against labeling foods as good or bad, but with the ultra processed foods, there are some very real addictive properties. And you mentioned Dr. Cynthia Bullock, and I heard her speak too about how she is starting to have some opinions on when you are refeeding people, that she feels like maybe it's a better idea to stay away from these addictive types of food. And so, how do we reconcile all of that? And how, can we talk about how we define restriction, what that really means, what that looks like, maybe to each of us in our own different realms? So, anyway, I'd just be interested to hear what you have to say about refeeding people and labeling food as good or bad, and how would you guide someone who's trying to recover from the eating disorder?
Yes. So I think this is such an important topic to delve into.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that these conversations also hold different meanings depending on whether or not we're talking to adults or children. So I
Mm-hmm.
mentioned that because
Oh.
one of the environmental triggers for me as a 12-year-old was a health class that I was taking in middle school right after my mother passed away. And the health teacher was well intentioned, but she was essentially telling us what foods to avoid and what foods to eat. And she was
Mm-hmm.
labeling foods as good or bad.
Mm-hmm.
And so she was saying, well, it's bad to eat too many hamburgers, or it's bad to eat too much pizza. It's good to eat fruits and vegetables. And she was really kind of telling us what was healthy, what was unhealthy. But there was a lot of subjectivity that was playing into that. And for me, as a people pleaser and a perfectionist, I began to think, well, I need to please my teacher and I should not eat any of these foods that are quote unquote bad because I'm going to be bad if I eat bad foods and I can be good
Oh.
if I eat good foods. And
Mm-hmm.
so, especially for children who have more difficulty kind of exploring nuance, there can be this very black
Mm-hmm.
and white thinking and these moral values that are ascribed to these food labels. And so I think
Mm-hmm.
that we just need to be aware of that when we're talking with children. And so we may need to use less black and white language when talking with them. And I think with adults, that it is important to recognize that there may be foods that feel like they're bad for us because they're triggering in some way, or they're just not good for our bodies, or we know when we eat them, we feel like we sort of spin out of control. And so I don't want to be the person who says you can't ever label foods as good or bad, because I think each of us begin in our adulthood to recognize which foods make us feel better and which foods really don't. And so I know, for instance, in my own recovery, there are some foods that are triggering for me because I used to have a distorted relationship with them when I was really sick. And so I tried to avoid those foods. And it tends to just be not a whole classification of foods, but just individual food items that I struggled with. And so for me, I don't personally call those bad, but I just kind of have those as being foods that I don't buy, right? Because I
Mm-hmm.
know that they could be triggering for me. And when we talk about people who are trying to restore their weight and treatment, if they've been struggling with anorexia, it is important to recognize that many people with these restrictive food disorders do have many nutritional deficiencies. Often we
Yeah.
find that they are deficient in vitamin A, in calcium, in zinc, in B12. And so when we think about sort of
Mm-hmm.
restoring their weight and rehabilitating them nutritionally, we do need to make sure that they're getting nutrient dense foods and that we are helping them to gain the weight that they need to gain in order to be healthy, and
Mm-hmm.
not just gain enough weight to be sort of on this very borderline baseline, where they're just barely where they need to be weight wise, but really restore them to the weight that they need to be at to sustain recovery. And
Mm-hmm.
so I think having these whole foods, nutrient dense foods can go a long way in terms of helping people to get weight restored and to be in a place where they can feel like their bodies are healthier and stronger.
I love that. And I really love the point that you made about it depends on what age they are. Duh. A light bulb moment. I never thought about that. I don't know why I was thinking there was just one blanket answer, but that was just so profound to go, yeah, you've got to meet people where they are, and children are going to understand things at a different level. And also, parents are the one bringing the food in the house. So, that would make a big impact too. And not only that, but yes, the conversation can be different. And my daughters have daughters, and they are very hyper aware about the conversation about not talking about fat or body shape or any type of diety type thing. When I grew up, it was very, my parents talked about weighing themselves every day and always being on a diet. So I did too. I literally don't remember when I wasn't on a diet from the time I hit puberty till my mid 50s, and I was always calorie counting in front of the kids and no, I can't eat that. And so I'm sure I left scars on them too, or made an imprint on their image, and now they're very, very careful about having those conversations or what's said in front of their children. And I is there advice for I'm going to focus on mothers with daughters just because I think that's the bigger percentage of our listening audience. Is there a conversation? What should that look like, mothers to daughters, to keep children, young girls healthy?
Yeah, I think it's really important to broach those conversations relatively early on. And for me, I really try to talk with my children about just what food does for our bodies. So I
Mm-hmm.
personally do avoid those good, bad foods with my children who are 7 and 9. And
Mm-hmm.
I think as we think about these mother daughter conversations with children, we can sort of neutralize it a little bit more. Instead of having this black and white language, we can talk about how food is fuel for our bodies, food keeps us strong, and there are different foods that may make us feel better in our bodies. And so it's really good to think about how can we eat those foods so that we can feel strong and we can run around the playground and we can do the monkey bars. And
Mm-hmm.
so I try to help them to see what food does for their bodies as
Mm-hmm.
opposed to talking in restrictive terms.
Mm-hmm.
And I really try to help them to just recognize that all bodies are worthy of respect. And for me, that's eating disorder prevention speak in some ways, because I do
Yeah.
think that when we think about environmental triggers, there's just so much fat phobia in our society. And
Yes.
so I do tell my children that all bodies are worthy of respect, no matter how short or tall, how big or small. And I don't want
I love
them
that.
to demonize people in larger bodies, because we all live in our bodies and we all, to some extent, even those of us in smaller bodies, do struggle with the
Totally.
effects of diet culture and fat phobia.
Totally.
And I want my children to be able to recognize diet culture and call it out. And so for me, sort of helping them to have acceptance of all bodies has been really important.
Yeah, I'm sitting here thinking about they call me Grandma because I make them call me Grandma. And so they know Grandma doesn't eat sugar. So I'm sitting here thinking, gosh, have I done a disservice by having that? I mean, they're hyper aware that I don't eat sugar. So I don't know if I've done something bad or I hope I haven't. I don't know if it's just made them aware. For instance, I was hearing someone on social media, and I think she might have been from the eating disorder world, about how she loves her body and respects her body and she's healthy and she works out and eats clean. But she says, if my daughter wants to go have an ice cream cone and I want to share a life moment with her, then I'm going to choose the ice cream cone over maybe working out that day if it's important to her. And I was thinking, I could never do that. I mean, I just can't have one ice cream cone. I literally am that severely addicted to sugar that that wouldn't be a life moment, because the minute it would go past my lips, I would check out of life and I would be hyper focused on how can I get another hit. And so and I don't know that what the right answer is. And so it goes back, I think, to what you were talking about, that we're all individuals and you have to find out the right answer for you. Because if I could go have one ice cream cone and skip down the lane the rest of the day, that would be great. I wouldn't probably be here in this seat right now, but I can't I mean, I just physically, that would wreck me. So, but I want to have life moments too. And so let's go to the playground. We can bring some apple slices and some fun sparkling water or something like that. And I'll play with you and slide down the slide. Or we're making scrapbooks together or crafts or something like that. So I just have to modify my life moments. But if that works for them, Rock on. Do you want to say anything about that as we end up, and maybe you can talk about the compassion that we need to practice for where we are in our
Yes.
situation?
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I do think that in some cases it can be important if we do find that we are, for instance, a type of person who is refraining from eating sugar or ultra processed foods, that if children ask, that we just be clear with them that this is not about Glamma trying to stay skinny or be skinny, but this is really about Glamma trying to kind of give my body what it wants and to really make sure that my body feels good and healthy. And sugar just makes my body feel really crummy. And so for me,
Mm-hmm.
I choose not to eat it. But that doesn't mean that you can't eat it, right? And obviously, we each have different views on what that means. But
Mm-hmm.
for instance, if I think about how this applies to my own dietary intake, I'm a vegetarian, so I don't eat meat. And I explain to my children why that is. But I also will sort of let them eat meat because I want them to make that choice on their own. I
Yeah.
think where it can get tricky is if parents have their own views on what they personally are eating or not eating, and then they try to make their children follow that very rigidly without giving context
Right.
as to why, then that can sometimes be too restrictive for children. And
Mm-hmm.
so I think we need to have a little bit more wiggle room when it comes to kids and their intake. And so I do let my kids eat meat. And if they get older and decide they want to become a vegetarian, then we'll talk about that then. But I don't
Mm-hmm.
want to determine that for them.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that when we think about all of this, we do need to have compassion with ourselves and just always kind of ask ourselves, why are we not eating a particular food? Why are we eating other foods, right? That other
Mm-hmm.
people may say are not good. And to just recognize that each of us are on our own sort of pathways with this. And we don't have to fit a one size fits all approach to this, right? And I think that it can be really easy to point fingers at people. And I see this happen a lot in the eating disorder field where eating disorder clinicians will say, well, it's horrible to say you can't ever eat ultra processed foods because we need to sort of be of this mindset that all foods fit. But then people who have struggled with ultra processed food use disorder will say, well, these foods make me feel really bad. I need to be able to
Mm-hmm.
eliminate them. And so I think
Mm-hmm.
we need to sort of do a better job of seeing each other's perspectives so
Yeah.
that we can really end up being respectful of our own choices and of others.
Yeah. I love it. That's a great way to end. Perfect way to end. I've really enjoyed our conversation, and I can't thank you enough for being here. And I would love to have you back again sometime. I love the discussion, and I love hearing each other's perspectives too. I think it helps everyone grow.
Yeah.
You want to let people know where they can find you if they want to find out more about you?
Sure. So I have a website. It's just my full name and it's Mallary Tenore Tarpley.com. Maybe we can put the link in the show notes since
Yeah,
that's a little bit
I
of a
can do that.
mouthful.
Yeah.
And yes, and then I have a weekly Substack newsletter where I talk about some of these topics, and that's just Mallary, Mallary.substack.com.
Wonderful. Thank you again. And we hope to talk to you soon. And if you want to find out more about us, you can find us at realfoodrecovery4u.com. That's the number 4 and the letter U. Thanks, guys. Bye bye.